Homeless veteran on trial. When the judge hears his name, the entire courtroom rises. He walked in handcuffed, head down, thin, wrapped in a worn-out coat that looked like it had survived decades, not seasons. His shoes were so worn that one foot touched the floor through the sole. His face bore more than wrinkles. It carried abandonment, too fragile to seem like a threat, too invisible to seem like anyone at all. Antonio Ribeiro, 73 years old, no fixed address, arrested for trespassing. The crime, sleeping behind a bakery on a night when the temperature hit 4 degrees below zero. Among empty sacks and the smell of stale bread, all he wanted was to survive the night. The courtroom was cold, almost hostile. In the back, the prosecutor adjusted his tie in a rush. The public defender hadn't even shown up. To everyone there, it was just another case, just another homeless man, disturbing the peace. Nothing worth special attention. But for Judge Larissa Montenegro, it wasn't like that. Sitting at the front of the room, she read the case file with eyes trained by routine. She flipped through the pages without hurry, until she stopped. Her gaze froze when she read the defendant's full name, Antonio Carlos Ribeiro. She felt her body stiffen. An old memory, one she kept like a scar, surfaced with sudden force. It was the name her brother repeated in handwritten letters, always followed by the same sentence. "If it weren't for him, I wouldn't have made it back." Enrique Montenegro, captain, killed in combat 19 years ago. But before he died, he often spoke with admiration, like a boy still in love with his uniform, about a man who had saved him in the field, a stubborn, quiet, courageous staff sergeant. She looked back at the defendant, head down, eyes lost, shoulders hunched, unrecognizable, and at the same time, unmistakable. Time had destroyed him, but it was him. Larissa swallowed hard. She tried to keep her expression neutral, but the hand holding her pen trembled. The cold, institutional atmosphere of the room seemed absurd in the face of that revelation. The hero from her brother's stories, handcuffed for seeking shelter from the cold. While the prosecutor read the charges out loud, indifferent, Larissa barely listened. The sound felt far away, muffled by the memory of Enrique's laugh, of the letters that smelled of sand and gunpowder, of the stories that always ended in gratitude for someone nobody else knew. But now, he was here, forgotten by everyone, except her. When the prosecutor suggested a sentence of restricted movement and community service, Antonio didn't react. He was motionless. It was as if he had already accepted whatever the world decided to impose on him. Still silent, Larissa wrote something on a small note. She folded it, quietly called over a court officer, and handed it to him. The order was clear. "Take this to Attorney Eduardo Ferraz. Personally." The officer left without question. In front of her, Antonio looked up for just a brief second. Their eyes met. She wanted to say something, but she couldn't. Not there. Not yet. The trial went on, but everything had already changed. As the court continued its bureaucratic rhythm, Larissa Montenegro seemed to be in two places at once, in the judge's chair, steady and silent, and in the past, hearing her brother's voice echo in her memory. Enrique spoke of that sergeant as if he were speaking of a father. He told how the man kept calm when everything turned to chaos, how he dragged the wounded under crossfire, how he held his hand when he thought he was going to die. "He taught me more in 3 days in the jungle than the entire academy taught me in 3 years, he wrote in one letter. "If I make it back, I want you to meet him." But she never met him. Enrique came back alive, but not for long. And now, almost 20 years later, that sergeant had reappeared, not as a hero, but as a defendant. Larissa didn't know whether she felt anger, pity, or shame. Maybe all of it at once. In front of her, Antonio remained motionless. When he spoke, It was in a low, disconnected voice. He said he had tried knocking on the bakery's door, that he hadn't wanted to break in. He just wanted a place where the cold didn't hurt so much. I just wanted a corner to lie down. That's all. Those were the only words he spoke that morning. Then the courtroom door opened. A tall man in a dark suit and serious expression walked in. His firm voice cut through the silence. Eduardo Ferraz, defense attorney. I'll be representing the defendant. The prosecutor barely hid his disdain. Voluntary representation, last minute, unacceptable. Larissa intervened without hesitation. Accepted. Proceed, Mr. Ferraz. Eduardo was no ordinary lawyer. His name was well known, a constant presence in high-profile cases. He usually didn't show up in proceedings like this, but he was there for a reason only Larissa knew. Ferraz flipped quickly through the case file. He asked simple questions, requested time, challenged the charge. In minutes, he dismantled the prosecutor's argument using basic principles of humanity and legality. There's no trespassing when there's no intent to take possession. There is desperation, survival, and social abandonment. The prosecutor countered, talking about repeat behavior. Eduardo fired back. What's repeated here isn't the crime, it's the negligence. The room fell silent. Meanwhile, Larissa kept her eyes fixed on Antonio. He remained detached, as if far away. He didn't seem to recognize Eduardo, not even himself. But Ferraz was already beginning to suspect this man wasn't just an ordinary homeless person. There was something in his posture. Even weakened, there was still firmness there. Discipline, buried under years of abandonment. At the end of the session, Eduardo approached Larissa in the hallway. Now tell me, who is he really? Larissa hesitated. The man who saved my brother's life. Eduardo was silent for a few seconds. Then he replied, without looking back, then we're not letting this get treated like just another case. Eduardo Ferraz wasn't the type to get involved on impulse, but there was something about this man that wouldn't let him rest. In the days following the hearing, he dove headfirst into Antonio's past. He started with the basics, public records, military files, lists of commendations, but it didn't take long to see the pattern. Too many missing pieces. Where there should have been detailed mission reports, there were only vague summaries. Where he expected to find medical records, there were gaps. It was as if, little by little, someone had erased Antonio from the official record. Stubborn, Eduardo dug deeper. He reached out to old army contacts, called in favors. Even a former client, now a retired colonel, was shocked when he heard the name. Antonio Ribeiro. That's a battlefield name. That man was a legend among the NCOs. How is he living on the streets? But no one knew where he had gone after his discharge. No one had seen him since. To the system, he had vanished. At the detention center where Antonio was being housed temporarily, Eduardo tried to earn his trust. He brought coffee, clean blankets, asked questions that got few answers. Antonio barely spoke. He would sit for hours staring at the floor. When he did speak, he mixed past and present, as if he was still on the battlefield. He mentioned names Eduardo didn't recognize, and one that he did. Enrique. Enrique. That kid was stubborn. His shoulder was busted, but he wanted to run back into the firefight. He murmured one random afternoon, without context. Eduardo watched it all, carefully, patiently. One day he brought a folder. He sat in front of Antonio and took out a faded, yellowed photo of a group of soldiers deep in the jungle. One of them, younger, smiled faintly. He was wounded, but he was smiling. This is Enrique Montenegro, isn't it? Antonio looked and stopped. Time seemed to freeze. His eyes, almost always vacant, lit up for a moment. His trembling hand reached out and touched the picture gently. His voice came out unsteady. I pulled him by the vest. He was down, leg full of shrapnel. He said he was going home, that he wanted to introduce me to his sister. Pause. He used to call me a stubborn old man. The silence that followed hurt more than any word. That was when Eduardo understood. This man still carried it all. The trauma, the guilt, the unfulfilled promise. That very night, Eduardo returned to his office and went over every line of what he had found so far. Finally, he spotted an opening, a discreet mention of military files recently made public through a declassification program. He accessed the portal, filled out requests, waited 48 hours, and then the names came, the mission, the ambush. Antonio Carlos Ribeiro acted under direct fire, saved 4 soldiers, and prevented the collapse of the troop during a forced retreat. Wounded, refused evacuation to keep helping, recommended for a commendation, but the process was never completed. It was all real. Eduardo printed the reports, highlighted the passages. He was organizing the papers when he stopped for a moment, looking at the desk covered in documents. Here was a whole man, with a history, with honor, with scars. A man the world had chosen to forget. He picked up the phone. "Larissa, yes? He didn't just save your brother. He saved an entire team. And after that, he was abandoned." She took a moment to respond. When she spoke, her voice was firm, but softer. "Bring everything. We're going to show the court who he is. But more than that, we're going to remind the country what he did." 2 weeks later, the courtroom was no longer the same. The man who had once seemed like just another vagrant now had a renowned lawyer by his side, and in front of them, a stack of documents no one expected to see. Eduardo Ferraz began his presentation calmly. He placed on the bench not only military reports, but a timeline. He pointed out omissions, ignored names, forgotten protocols. He read excerpts, highlighted dates, showed copies of documents stamped by the army itself. According to what was now official, Antonio Ribeiro had prevented the deaths of at least 5 soldiers during an ambush overseas. He had been nominated for the National Order of Courage, but the process had been shelved after his medical discharge. The room went silent. The prosecutor, until then indifferent, shuffled the papers before him like a man trying to reorganize his own argument. But at that moment, there was no argument left. Then Judge Larissa authorized the calling of witnesses. The first was a tall, gray-haired man in a full-dress uniform, retired General Augusto Morales. "Staff Sergeant Ribeiro saved my life. I was a lieutenant on that mission. I was hit in the shoulder, out in the open. He dragged me nearly 100 meters under fire. I never forgot. But the system seems it did." 2 other former soldiers followed, each telling how they had been saved by the man who now could barely keep his back straight in his chair. Antonio listened in silence. He seemed unable to believe they were talking about him. Eduardo then requested a reading from the declassified report. Staff Sergeant Ribeiro demonstrated conduct involving extreme personal risk, remaining in a defensive position after ensuring the evacuation of 3 wounded soldiers. His voluntary stay provided time for the platoon to regroup and prevented further casualties. The entire room listened in absolute silence. Not even the sounds of footsteps or rustling papers could be heard. That's when Larissa spoke. Her voice was firm, but her eyes were wet. "What we have here is not just a case file. It is the portrait of a system's failure. A man who served with honor, who was forgotten due to administrative errors, and who now, in cruel irony, sits here as a defendant when he should be standing here to be honored." She then motioned toward the door. 2 soldiers entered. One carried a small blue box. Inside, a golden pin, the National Order of Courage, a decoration delayed for nearly 20 years. Antonio looked at it without understanding. It took him a few seconds to process. When he realized what it was, his first reaction was to reject it. "No," he said quietly. "I couldn't save Henrique. He died because of me. Larissa approached, ignoring protocol, not as a judge, as a sister. He lived because of you. He came home. He wrote to me. He described you as the bravest man he ever met. And he asked me to find you. Antonio didn't answer. He just cried. And in that room, where moments earlier he had been seen only as an intruder, everyone stood. The prosecutor, the court staff, the soldiers, the onlookers. No one said anything. No one needed to. Larissa took a deep breath. The charges are dismissed, and the state must immediately begin the process of restoring all rights and benefits provided by law. Eduardo nodded. Antonio lowered his head, but this time not in shame. It was relief. The following week, what should have been just an administrative formality became a moment of historic reparation. Antonio was called back to court, but this time not as a defendant, but as an honoree. The room wasn't as full as before. There were no curious spectators or rushing journalists. The atmosphere was more contained, more intimate. Eduardo stood beside him, along with two National Army officers now wearing ceremonial uniforms. And Larissa, high on the bench, could no longer hide what she felt. She wasn't just a judge. She was Enrique's sister. She was someone who carried the same debt the country owed that man. Antonio entered wearing new clothes. A simple suit, but clean, shaven. His body still stooped, but different, not from age, but from the weight of the past, a weight that was finally beginning to lift. He was called to the center of the room. One of the officers read in a firm voice, "For proven bravery in combat, conduct involving extreme personal risk and direct contribution to the survival of members of the armed forces, the National Army hereby bestows, with honor, the National Order of Courage upon Staff Sergeant Antonio Carlos Ribeiro." The blue box was opened. The medal gleamed under the room's light. But Antonio didn't move. He looked at the decoration as if it were a shattered mirror, took a deep breath, and spoke, his voice breaking, "I don't deserve this. He died." Silence fell instantly. Eduardo stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. But he lived long enough to come back, to write, to say thank you, and to tell a sister that you were the reason he still had hope. Larissa stood, stepped down from the bench. "Death doesn't erase what was saved, Staff Sergeant. You gave my brother time, and you gave our family more than words can ever explain." Antonio closed his eyes. A sob escaped. He still held his guilt like an old rifle. "I just did what anyone would have done," he whispered. The officer handed him the medal. Antonio took it with both hands, unsure whether to wear it or simply look at it. Finally, he closed his eyes and rested his forehead against it. "Thank you," he said with difficulty, "for not forgetting me completely." The next gesture didn't come from Larissa or the soldiers. It came from the prosecutor. He stood, straightened his posture, and saluted. The entire room followed, not out of protocol, but out of respect. That afternoon, the government formalized the granting of a lifetime pension, assisted housing and full medical care to Staff Sergeant Antonio Ribeiro. The case was forwarded to the Ministry of Defense as a symbol of failure and reparation. And the press, always showing up when it's too late, now wanted headlines, interviews, coverage. But Antonio refused. All he wanted was silence, and a place where he could at last sleep in peace. It was small, a bedroom, a bathroom, a kitchen with a table and 2 chairs, but it was his. After so long sleeping on cardboard, under awnings, on park benches, that quiet apartment felt like a castle. There was no luxury, but there was warmth. The walls weren't moldy, the bed had clean sheets, the shower worked. Antonio spent his days in silence. Every morning, he made coffee like it was a ritual. He watched the water boil, waited for the foam to rise, filled the cup carefully as if it were the most important moment of the day. It was. The television stayed off, the windows stayed open. He liked the sound of the street, honking, footsteps, random voices. It was proof that he was part of the world again. He got visitors sometimes, nurses, social workers, soldiers coming to check paperwork. But the only time he truly smiled was when Eduardo showed up. He always came unannounced, brought bread, fruit, news from the city. They didn't talk much, but when Eduardo sat down, Antonio relaxed. For the first time in many years, there was someone he didn't have to defend himself against. "Everything all right now, Mr. Antonio?" the lawyer would ask. He shrugged. "I'm trying to learn how to be at peace. It's harder than it looks." Sleeping was still difficult. Sometimes he woke up sweating, hearing gunfire that no longer existed. On other nights, he cried silently, wrapped in a blanket. But now there was something different. He knew he could close his eyes again, and that made all the difference. One Friday afternoon, the intercom buzzed. It was Larissa. Antonio hesitated. He hadn't expected her. He thought of saying no, out of shame. But something inside told him he should see her. He opened the door. She was standing there, holding a folder, her face gentle. "May I come in?" He nodded without a word. They sat at the kitchen table. For a few seconds, the only sound was the kettle on the stove. Larissa set the folder on the table and slid it toward him. "They're letters. From my brother. They were kept at my mother's house. Some of them I'd never read." Antonio touched the envelope as if it were glass, slowly opened it, pulled out a carefully folded letter. He recognized the handwriting. "Sergeant Ribeiro saved me, not just my body but my mind. He taught me to stay calm, not to give in to panic. He taught me what courage is. If I make it back, I want you to meet this man. He doesn't talk much, but he says everything in what he does." Antonio read in silence, then another and another. Some spoke of the battlefield, others of fear, but all of them ended with gratitude. He took a deep breath and murmured, "For so long I thought no one remembered." Larissa, her eyes brimming with tears, replied, "The world may forget, but the one who was saved never forgets." That night, Antonio slept without nightmares. For the first time in years, the silence didn't hurt. Antonio was getting used to his new routine. The silence of the apartment was different from the silence of the streets. Here, it didn't hurt. Here, he could close his eyes without fear of being kicked, woken up, or chased away. He drank his coffee slowly, straightened the crooked frames on the wall, swept the floor even when it was clean. He was starting to understand what it meant to have a place. One ordinary afternoon, the doorbell rang. It was Larissa. She carried a large brown envelope, but this time, it wasn't to be opened there. She only said, "This is for when you're ready. But most important, Antonio, you made it back." He nodded. Didn't answer. Didn't need to. When she left, he didn't open the letter. He placed the envelope on the table, sat by the window. Down below, children were running in the square. There was sunshine, a light breeze, a strange feeling, a peace he didn't recognize but didn't reject. He stayed there for minutes, maybe hours, until he spoke, as if talking to an absence. "For so long, I thought no one remembered." And for the first time, it didn't sound like a lament. It was just a statement. At that moment, someone across the square, a boy in a military school uniform, ran by, stopped, looked up. He waved. A simple gesture, without knowing who the old man at the window was. Antonio waved back, smiled, small, subtle, but real. If this story reminded you that no one should be forgotten, tap like. And write just one thing in the comments. I remember. Sometimes, that's all it takes to honor those who deserve it.